WordPress Accessibility Day 2023 Keynote, a conversation with Jennison Asuncion. Speakers for this talk include Jennison Asuncion, co-founder, Global Accessibility Awareness Day, GAAD, and the GAAD Foundation, and Joe Dolson, WordPress Accessibility Day lead organizer and owner of Accessible Web Design. This presentation was recorded on September 27th, 2023.
Welcome, everybody, to WordPress Accessibility Day 2023. My name is Joe Dolson, and I am one of the lead organizers for this event, and I am thrilled to be here for my keynote conversation with Jennison Asuncion. Jennison founded Global Accessibility Awareness Day in 2012, which is an event dedicated to learning about digital access and inclusion about people with disabilities. And that event was a key inspiration for when we founded WordPress Accessibility Day in 2020. It was an incredibly important movement in the accessibility space and still is. And Jennison has continued on to found the Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation, which has an even deeper mission to promote accessibility throughout the world. So I am thrilled to be here with Jennison. And we're going to have a whole conversation. I have a bunch of questions for Jennison, but that doesn't mean we're not going to also have public Q&A at the end. So feel free to add your questions to the Q&A section in the Zoom chat, and we will answer those as best we can at the end of the session. So Jennison, welcome. So happy to have you here.
Hey, Joe, it's a real privilege to be here. I didn't realize that WordPress Accessibility Day until you had told me that it had gotten its inspiration from GAAD. And just one quick shout out to Joe Devon, who is the co-founding partner of both the foundation and Global Accessibility Awareness Day. This is certainly not a journey I've done on my own, but I am so happy to be here with you, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks so much. It would be great to have Joe and you both here, but I have personally been confused for Joe Devon so many times that I'd feel slightly uncomfortable being in the same room. It might be a little awkward.
There you go.
But you're here, we're here, let's chat. So of course, as I just said, Global Accessibility Awareness Day was a huge inspiration for WordPress Accessibility Day. And that's been going on for over 10 years. And these events are really driven towards trying to create a sea change in technology. How have you felt that these events have really impacted your experience with accessibility on the web?
Right. Well, we'll start with the stark reality, right? Which is that at this point in time, and it hasn't really changed that much over the years, to be honest, we're looking at 4% of websites out there are quote unquote meeting the the minimum accessibility bar. Because if you look at the WebAIM studies, looking at it the other way, what is it? 97% of sites have at least one accessibility issue. So that hasn't unfortunately changed. And so how that trickles down to me as an end user, as someone who's blind, who uses screen reading software, I still encounter the same frustrations that everyone else has over the years in terms of custom controls that have not been properly coded. So I'm trying to find a checkbox and I can't check it because it's not keyboard operable or navigable, or I don't know that something is actually supposed to be a checkbox. Dynamic content that isn't being properly signaled to me. So that's that. Now, on the flip side, though, what I am seeing in terms of change is just the number of people who are stepping in, who are interested in accessibility, who are not necessarily working in accessibility full time. There's room for everyone in the accessibility conversation. You get people who are quietly making changes within their company where they don't necessarily have an accessibility team, or small teams that don't have the same visibility as some of the larger companies doing their thing. So there's a lot of movement happening. However, the reality is there's so many pages being pumped out onto the web at any given moment in time, which is why the numbers are still the way they are, unfortunately, in terms of those pages and sites that are quote unquote accessible.
Yeah, I think, the volume of content and websites being created nonstop is
Oh,
definitely one of those big challenge points.
it's
And if you haven't,
yeah,
I just want to quickly call out the Web A Million, which is the
yes.
statistical data set Jennison was referring to there, which is a great study that the nonprofit organization WebAIM does every year, looking at a general survey of accessibility among the top sites. And yeah, those numbers are just as bad as it sounds. It's really incredibly bad.
And just to paint a bigger picture, just for those who may not know that, we talk about pages going out all the time. That's literally happening all the time. You know, people are changing pages day by day. Gone are the days where people would just wait and have releases like once every 4 or 5 months. People are changing things dynamically. So even for me, like I'll go to a website, going about my day-to-day tasks, and suddenly I'll notice there's been a change to something. And the way I compare it to people or talk to people about it is, as someone who is blind, it's like for me going into a room, expecting it to be laid out a certain way, and then I walk in and someone's moved the coffee table, or someone's moved a chair, and it just happens so quickly and so dynamically. That I think is the biggest change that I've seen in the last number of years, is how quickly that's happening.
That is definitely true. And actually, I think this is an excellent segue to WordPress. Because, of
Yeah.
course, first of all, in terms of volume, WordPress represents some 40% of websites that exist. So huge, huge impact on the web. And second, WordPress is absolutely one of those applications that's been churning out change at a higher and higher pace in the last few years, with the onset of the block editor, with the changes in Gutenberg, and all of these rapid changes. Now, before this talk, I just threw a ton of WordPress websites at Jennison for him to look at, crossing all sorts of different types of websites: classic themes, accessibility ready themes, page builders, sites built with the WordPress site editor. So after looking at all of that, what's your general feeling about how WordPress developers are doing in paying attention to accessibility in their work?
Yeah. I would say that based on the sites I've looked at, um, WordPress developers, honestly speaking, are as they're as they are as good as any other web developers like on other non-WordPress sites. And what I'm saying there is, there's going to be accessibility issues. Like there were some pages that I looked at that had things, but for me as an end user, keep in mind, like I wouldn't necessarily know WordPress from not, right? Like if you're looking at me as an average user, I'm just looking at the page and the experience itself. So some pages I saw were just fine. Others, there were there was one site in particular that had it was it's interesting. It was pointed out to me that it had won an award for like the best designed website in 2022. But from my look at it, it was just a plain text page. I am convinced that there was more going on. Joe, this was the improver page. Um, and I'm convinced there was more happening on that page than I, as a screen reader user, would have known, because I can't think that a page that strictly had text on it and one form would have been
Yes.
flagged as the most designed page. And I'm not being critical. I'm just saying, like, there's something I was missing there, because I looked at it and I went, "This is nice. It's all like text and headings, but there has to be something. There has to be something happening there that has given it that prestigious um, designation."
So I'm going to tell you that that website is, yeah, it's got an awful lot of animation on it.
Huh.
So this is a good example of how, things get credited with great design chops, and that doesn't necessarily play out for all audiences. Everything they did is essentially absolutely meaningless to Jennison. Although I will say that some of them could cause problems for people with vestibular disabilities or who have nausea triggered from motion. These could be real problems. But it was nothing for Jennison. It's just there is no design there. If anybody wants to look at that website, I will say, in my opinion, it's terrible. If you do suffer from nausea, I do not recommend looking at it. The URL, however, is impvr.com. That's impvr.com. I found it to be a bit of a nightmare.
And see, that would have been something that again, like you said, it would have been lost on me. But I think to that point, I think the one thing that people should understand, particularly for screen reader users, but I would say for anyone using assistive technology, is that the reality is whatever type of experience you are designing for the quote unquote everyday user, so someone who doesn't have a disability or impairment, the lens that I, as a screen reader user, are going to look at that site is going to be totally different. The experience is going to be dictated by the way the screen reader decides it's going to voice the page to me, the way the screen reader and the browser are going to play together. There is no concept of left and right. I always hear about the left rail and the right rail. To me, I'm listening to a page starting at the very top, going left to right, top to bottom. So, and I think that's it's not necessarily talked about, the fact, so so when Joe sent me a bunch of the different sites, he would give me some great descriptions and at least give me cues, like this was built using a page builder, this was built using a plugin, this was built using this or that, or this was built using the classic theme. At the end of the day, a lot of that are visual cues or visual styles and things like that sadly are lost on me as a screen reader user. And I only mention that just because there might be some people out there who have heard of screen readers, who kind of know what they do and things like that, but they might not get the full understanding. And the fact that the screen is being presented to me in a totally different linear way than you as a seeing person are looking at the screen.
I think that's an incredibly important thing to recognize about the whole design process. And recently at the WordPress Community Summit in Washington, D.C., I did participate in a conversation that was about embracing accessibility first design, which is essentially this concept that the design process should be based on working out the sequence, working out the control order, working out how things work in a code and semantic manner before you start layering on visual design, so that you've got this design that's based on everybody's experience, because everybody's going to have that as a common experience. What do you have? Do you have any feelings about the idea of accessibility first design?
Well, this plays to this whole idea of the whole quote unquote shift left, that those of us who work in accessibility, this is one of the key mantras of this last few years, is this whole shift left approach and thinking about accessibility from the very, very start. And that also includes including people with disabilities as co-creators of the design, or at a minimum walking through prototypes, getting feedback, all of that kind of stuff directly from folks with disabilities. Because as much as designers and as anyone can, know quote unquote the right things to do, that nothing will ever replace actually speaking to someone who lives that experience every day, who is actually using a screen reader day and night, or using voice recognition software all the time, or enlarges the screen. It's a totally different thing. So having that feedback early on in the process is so vital. Otherwise you end up in this situation where all the best intentions were done, And everything that you talked about, Joe, was thought about. Decisions have been made because it was deemed to be okay. Well, this is what we think is the right thing, and then you're so close to launch, and then you have people with disabilities try it out, and you learn at that point that the things could have been done in a more efficient way, or because there is this whole thing of the difference between something being accessible versus something being usable.
Oh, 100%. And
Yeah,
I would say
right.
that that is the thing that I have learned more than anything else from interacting directly with people with disabilities.
Right.
I've been doing this for a long time. I have a great sense of, how things are communicated. So I know what will be communicated.
Mm-hmm.
But learning from people with disabilities tells me so much about the usability of how that's all put together.
Yeah.
Why it makes a difference that I put in a line break here and I shouldn't have, because now it's read as two separate statements if you're reading through. Things like that I just maybe wouldn't have thought of. So yeah, for anybody at any level, any degree of expertise, working directly with people with disabilities is crucial to really getting a good sense. So segueing from that, seems really natural to talk about a little bit about your goals in your day job at LinkedIn. One of those goals is getting more people with disabilities into the workforce, not just as accessibility testers or as specialists, but people who are performing day-to-day work in all areas, people who are involved in this creation of products, but not specialized in accessibility. In WordPress, one of our goals in the accessibility team is to build a platform that supports people with disabilities in creating and editing web content. Now, I don't know how far WordPress has really gotten to that. We've worked hard, but there's so much to do, and it's always fighting against designers. But two parts to this question. How much of an impact do you think we can have if we really get a great, accessible back-end program in WordPress at getting people with disabilities employed productively? And then I did also ask you to look at the WordPress admin. And do you have any thoughts about where we stand on that?
Sure. So let me take your first question. I mean, the impact is significant. If you are wanting to say like, why should we be doing this? Why should we be making the WordPress backend in particular? Why should we be making that accessible? Because people with disabilities, from an employment perspective, why wouldn't they want to be developers or designers of WordPress sites? That's from a gainful employment. You talked about 40% of websites these days are powered by WordPress, right? Why wouldn't people with disabilities want to cut of the action, right? To be productive and to be productive people working behind the scenes, building sites. Now that's from that perspective. So that's employment. But then beyond that, what if with someone with a disability just wants to get out there and be known, whether it's they want to start a business or they just want to put out a blog and get known out there. They want to be out there, part of the conversation or part of the e-business or the e-commerce realm, if you will.
100%.
I'm blocking all of that and making all of that the pieces to creating WordPress, making that all accessible, opens that whole world up. Without it, we would be either having to depend on other people to design the sites for us, and that takes away our independence. Like, why can't we, what if we decide at 2 a.m. we come up with this really neat idea and thought we want to just get it into we want to get that implemented. Well, I'd rather not have to wait to till daytime to ask someone to give me a hand with it. I'd like to be able to independently get in there and make that change myself as as an end user, as an admin. So I think it is so crucial. And again, given the market share that you folks have, people want to use WordPress, and that includes folks with disabilities and impairments. And like I said, in all different realms.
Yeah, I think, you really nailed one of the places where accessibility and WordPress really need to be coming together and should be coming together. And that's that, WordPress has this publishing policy about democratizing publishing. Like that's the whole goal of WordPress. And that doesn't really mean anything until we have a really, truly, fully accessible backend, because
Absolutely.
right now we're democratizing really only for those who have a specific subset of capabilities.
Right. Absolutely. And I just want to point out that, people with disabilities, we're not a monolith. We all have different needs. And I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but, just because something is accessible to me, quote unquote, doesn't mean it's going to be accessible and usable to someone else who might also be a blind screen reader user, which also means that people with another disability might find the experience completely accessible to them, right? So just to make it clear that when you're talking to your point, Joe, about democratizing, you need to think about the full breadth of disability and impairment. And it's not just about screen reader users. It includes the full range of disability or impairment, which is why it's so important to include people with a variety of disabilities or impairments who are using a variety of different assistive technologies or not. They might just be low vision and using a mouse, able to use a mouse. So just getting a full range as you're continuing to democratize. Now, to get to your other question, you did give me access to the admin experience for your latest version. I didn't have a chance to look at the classic version. Just be transparent on that. But two things that that I'll mention. So styles. There's this ability to change the styles, and I'm just looking at my notes real quick. That when I was looking at the styles, so it said like, yeah, so it said like, choose a different style, choose a different style for the combinations, and it gave me a list of the different styles. So for example, aubergine, blockout, canary, electric. As I was going down that list, I was like, it would be really great to actually get a description of what those styles look like, even if it's just telling me what the fonts, like what makes electric. As it stood, they were just words to me with buttons. So, even though I'm blind, I want the page, like if I'm going to create a page, I want it to look visually appealing. So not knowing what electric was versus canary in having some sort of alternative text description of what those styles were.
Yeah, and I think that's
that I would know.
Yeah, that's a really good example of those places where, we can just need to do a better job at providing a good description of what something is going to do visually. And I will tell you, actually, I'm aware of that issue. So just for context for other people paying attention, what Jennison is talking about there is the style selection of alternate styles within a theme in the site editor. Which is kind of a powerful new option, just to have style variations available for these themes. It's neat. But as he said, when he's exploring them, he just doesn't get enough information to know why he would pick any particular style. And it's an error in judgment to think that just because somebody can't see the styles, that they don't care what they're doing, what they're choosing. And so providing those descriptions is legitimately difficult. I mean, it's difficult to describe exactly what has changed here without having paragraph after paragraph. But that's kind of the point of trying to come up with a really well thought about design variation, is that it should be expressible relatively easily.
Right.
But that's an interesting example.
And just on the styles for a second, one other thing maybe to look into is that when I selected a style, just choose any one of them, it would tell me that was the current style selected. But then I tried to select a different style, and I wasn't quite sure if I unselected one and selected the other because it wouldn't, any other style that I selected, it wouldn't say anything. So I'm not sure if that was just a bug or whatnot, but I could only select one style at a time. I couldn't switch between them. So
That sounds
that's
like a bug.
yeah.
I'll look into that.
and and then there was just one other example that I'll bring up. So there was this when you're at the place where you're adding a page, you had three choices. You could go public, private, or password protected were the three options, and they were radio buttons. So as a keyboard only screen reader user, my expectation is that I would be able to move using the up and down arrow keys between those three radio buttons and choose one of those options. But what was happening is every time I choose one, a dialogue, I'd expect it to be a modal, would pop up and say something. So essentially, I would be trapped in that choice.
There is an open issue for dealing with that. And I can explain why that happens at the moment. And it's because ages and ages ago, when WordPress was originally set up, password protected is just a variation on published.
Right.
And so in order to choose password protected, it has to publish the post. So then it has to prompt you to agree to publish the post, which is, it's messy. And there are some fairly significant backwards compatibility issues, but the interface could be much better.
Right.
The interface shouldn't raise that kind of confusion just because there's a back end problem that doesn't allow people to make the UI exactly what they want it to be. And I think that's a great example of something that works really easily and is very straightforward for somebody who's sighted using a mouse, but is incredibly confusing if you're not.
Well, I would expect that even if you were just a seeing keyboard only user, that you would also encounter an issue, because like I said, at least from my experience, it was like you couldn't arrow up and down within the options in the radio buttons. You were just stuck in the one because the modal opened.
Indeed. Yeah.
So anyway, those are just two examples of just interesting things that I experienced while looking at the admin. But what's great is, you folks are continually iterating on stuff. So I think I'd be happy to keep looking, and I think the more folks with disabilities who get an opportunity to take a look and try out the admin panel, you'll get a really good, I think, really great feedback. So I really encourage that.
Great. Yes, absolutely. We always want feedback. We are fortunate to have at least one very heavy contributor programmer who is blind and is working very hard on making things better. He's also one of the organizers for this conference. So that's been incredibly valuable, and thanks, Alex, for everything you've done. But one person working in their spare time when they're not at their full-time job is not enough to really keep up and make everything done. So we always want more. But I think we should be talking about this Global Accessibility Awareness Day Foundation, because that is an amazing project of yours that's coming up, yours and Joe's. So obviously this is one of the most recent changes in GAAD, is the creation of this foundation. It's got lots of really great programs. What are you most excited about right now to try and move digital accessibility forward with the foundation?
Sure. So two things. So we started the foundation because Joe and I, we were coming upon our 10th anniversary, and we were like, we need to do something. We want to do something. And because Joe and I apparently aren't busy enough, we decided, well, why don't we start a foundation where GAAD itself is part of it. But part of what we're trying to do, and the mission, is really to disrupt the culture of technology and digital product development so that accessibility becomes a core requirement. And what does that mean really in practical terms? So part of it is just allowing increasing the conversation that's happening between the accessibility community, which arguably because I'm part of the community, we can get into a bubble, right? And we can just talk amongst ourselves and just get frustrated and wring our hands, and that just happens. But what really needs to happen is we need to be reaching out. So what what we've established is something called the GAAD Speakers Fund, is one of the programs. And essentially what that does is it provides up to $3,000 in funding for either one of three scenarios. For an everyday technology person who, so that means someone who doesn't work in accessibility, but who has gotten a talk accepted at an accessibility focused event. For example, the CSUN Assistive Technology Conference. Those conferences are not cheap. So we want to make it possible, if you get your talk accepted, to have cost defrayed, whether it's for a hotel, whether it's for childcare or elder care at home, or whatever it is. So up to $3,000. So that's one scenario. Another scenario is an accessibility person who works in accessibility full time, who gets an in-person talk accepted at a non-accessibility event, say South by, or any number of events that are happening all over the world that have nothing to do with accessibility per se, but they've gotten a talk accepted. There's still costs associated with that, travel, all of that stuff. So that's another audience for the GAAD Speakers Fund. And the third audience are end users with disabilities or impairments, who have gotten something accepted. Because again, people with disabilities tend to not have the kind of disposable income that would make it possible to attend a conference. So that's, we're trying to open that opportunity and to broaden the conversations, because we think that that's a big thing and an important thing that will help with our ultimate mission. The other big thing that's kind of exciting that's coming up November 9th is our first annual GAAD Awards. And those are projects that are basically living the mission of the foundation, that are putting accessibility first, that are involving people with disabilities in the design and development. When we decided to do the GAAD Awards, we were like, okay, well, maybe we'll get one or two submissions and we'll call it a day. But we were so gratified, and also had a lot of work in having to choose amongst 18 submissions, really great submissions. And of course, for this first one, we had to make the difficult choice to choose 3, and we'll be making that announcement of who those 3 are next week. But save the date, November 9th. The celebration will happen in San Francisco. It's a bit of a fundraiser for the foundation, not a huge monetary. It's $60 a ticket, but it will be in San Francisco on November 9th. Details next week. And to learn more about the foundation and the other programs that we have, you can go over to GAAD, which is GAAD.foundation. And you can even, there's a sign up form there that you can sign up to keep up to date on things happening. But those two programs in particular, Joe, are where we're just trying to contribute to widening the conversation with the Speakers Fund. But with the GAADs, the one thing we don't do well, I don't think, in the accessibility industry is reward and recognition. People put sweat and tears. Like you folks putting together this conference, this event, and all the work you folks are doing behind the scenes to make WordPress accessible. I just sure hope that you folks are celebrating internally, but externally, we don't celebrate enough. So we're hoping with the GAADs, in addition to making it something that people want to do, in terms of living the mission of the foundation, it's an opportunity to celebrate. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. We always talk about this. Accessibility is a journey, and it's Merrill K. Evans talks about progress over perfection. And those of us who've been working in accessibility for any length of time, I've been doing this since 2006. We've known this all along, that nothing is ever going to be 100% accessible, particularly these days with things changing all the time. But we keep moving and we keep getting things better. So yeah, we're really, I could talk forever about the foundation, but we're just hoping to do our part. We've had GAAD for the last number of years, but with these other programs and more to come, we're just hoping to just help out as best we can to solve this, to crack this thing about increasing from 4% of accessible sites. We've got to do better than
We
that.
got to crack that 5% bar.
We've got to do better than that.
Yeah, I think, those are such,
and having
yes,
fun
I
doing
mean,
it.
having fun is such a big thing. I mean, sometimes there can be a lot of stress in doing
Oh,
accessibility.
burnout is so
Every
burnout.
time,
Yeah, burnout is so, it's a thing. That's the
and every
one
time
thing.
you don't achieve your goal, you feel like you've really let somebody down.
Yeah.
Which is hard.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. Celebrating that more is something we should do. And we like to see this event as kind of a celebration of accessibility.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of part of the goal, but you're not wrong in observing that there's a lot of work in putting it on.
Yes.
That is very true.
Yes.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're doing this program to support speakers. And that, I mean, for this event, one of the main reasons we broke away from the WordPress community organization and became an independent organization was simply because that would allow us to pay speakers. The WordPress community organization does not permit or organizations running under their auspices to pay speakers. So we were like, well, for us, that's just really important because people with disabilities are in general an under-monetized group. They do not get paid well enough. They are underemployed. We can't ask them to be speaking at our event without offering them some kind of remuneration. So I think that's huge.
Yeah. Can I just extend that a little bit, Joe, and also say,
Yes, absolutely.
Even like user research studies, those of us with disabilities are happy to help, but our time is valuable too. And so, here or there, doing a one-off is one thing, but you got to pay people with disabilities if they're going to be involved in user research studies.
Yeah, it's not. This isn't somebody just doing something they love. Like, this is somebody going in and they're going to possibly be incredibly frustrated using your crappy product, and they should get paid for that no matter what. I think that's just a general principle of all employment. It doesn't matter what service you're asking somebody to do for you, you need to be paying that person.
Yeah.
The WordPress community, a group of people have recently started a project called the WordPress Community Collective, which is looking for funding to help support open source, specifically in WordPress. And one of their projects is looking for funding to help people contributing to the accessibility of WordPress. So that's another way of approaching this funding thing, is trying to fund the people who are doing day-to-day work in trying to make WordPress more accessible. Has the foundation given any thought to other programs that might fund developers directly as opposed to speakers?
That is actually, so short answer is no, not yet. But that's just because the foundation, is we're still in our early stages. But that is a really interesting thought and idea, which I will take back as a yet another program. You're adding to our workload there, Joe. But no, that's so important too. We do have something. We're not paying per se, but we do have another program called the GAAD Pledge, which invites open source projects, including WordPress, to potentially spend a year taking the GAAD Pledge. And what that just means is you are committing to spend that year, making your framework, your widgets, your libraries, all that accessible, but also making your documentation, creating documentation on accessibility, all of that kind of stuff. We've had, for example, React Native take the GAAD Pledge. We've had Drupal take the pledge, and Ember, and this year Intel is taking the pledge with their open source projects. So something to, if WordPress might be interested in taking the GAAD pledge next year or the year after that, whenever, that is an option um, under the auspices of a program within the foundation. But what you propose, Joe, is really interesting, and something as vice chair I will take back for us to think about, to see how we might be able to execute on that in the coming years.
Yeah, there are a lot of projects that just, one of the things they need is funding, and that is always a huge challenge for everything everywhere.
Oh, yes.
Accessibility is always underfunded.
Oh, yes.
So we're now at just 10 minutes left until we have to stop.
Wow.
So I'm going to just go and look and see what we've got for some questions.
Sure.
So the first question is actually extremely apropos to what we've been just talking about. And the question is, does anybody know of any funding available to help make their website accessible? I guess that would be in the form of grants.
I don't know.
Do you know anything?
I have no.
It feels like it's the sort of thing that there absolutely should be grant programs for, helping organizations with the funding to hire people to make their stuff more accessible. But I have to admit, I don't offhand know anything about that. I know lots of organizations that do grants to build websites, but
Right.
not necessarily to fix the websites that have already been built.
Now, that's interesting, Joe, because you mentioned there are grants that will help pay to build a website. Not knowing about any of these programs, wouldn't it be awesome if they committed to building accessible websites?
Yeah, well, hypothetically, if they were federal grants, then they actually are technically already obligated to meet Section 508 because they are paid for by the government. But yeah, I know that there's always problems with enforcement and follow-up and actually getting anybody who can check on that and make sure it's actually happening. There's just not enough expertise in the web development community to reliably count on that.
And if I could just say, real quick, around the WebAIM study and the fact that there's like 97% of websites have accessibility issues, I'd say the balance of websites, just in my experience, are those websites that are owned by small to medium-sized businesses or just by everyday folks out there. And what I need to keep reminding some of my peers in the accessibility space is that for some of these folks who have these websites, even that they might be big and popular, their IT budget or their budget to develop the website might be only a couple of $1,000s. When you look at how much it costs to get a site audited for accessibility and remediated, those are real dollars. And something has to happen. That's a separate conversation for a different day, but something has to happen to bring that cost down. So the average Joe or Joanne who wants to make their website accessible, they genuinely want to, they just can't afford it.
Yeah, it's hard.
Right?
I mean, there are challenges and costs all the way down the line from doing the testing to find out what your problems are. And then, if you're not an expert in web development already,
most people
then
are
now
not,
you don't know what to do about that. Great, you've got problems. Wonderful.
They're using plugins or builders.
It's hard.
Or things like that. It's hard, but I think that conversation needs to happen in terms of figuring out how we can, and everyone will say, well, if you include accessibility from the beginning, that's fine for people who are thinking about it. But for those people who, for whatever reason, haven't thought about it, but then have seen the light, if you will, and now want to make their site accessible, where do they start? Well, they need to get an audit or do something like that. How much does it cost? $10,000.
Absolutely. So this is actually an excellent segue into another question we have here. Somebody asked about, it just jumped because somebody else added a question. The question is, what effective change management strategies can we adopt as designers and developers? This person, Michael Nyogu, I probably butchered that, but we're just going to go with it. It says he's a designer in a humanitarian organization that tends to accommodate accessibility rather than including it throughout the product life cycle. So I think he's looking about how can you change that? How can you
Yeah,
get
but
good
it's all
strategies to that?
it's all the cultural, it's the culture change that has to happen. And honestly, it starts with building empathy. Your average designer or developer has never interacted with someone with a disability or impairment, right? Let's just accept that as a truth, because you know we are the largest minority, but we're not everywhere. And so people aren't thinking about people who might be using an alternative input device. They're not using a mouse, or people who cannot see the screen. They're just not thinking about that. So it starts with empathy, bringing in actual end users and actually watching them try to use your website. That's one step. Then bringing in training, actually doing training and making that available to engineers and to designers, learning how to annotate your designs, all that good stuff. But then you also need to have a support system in place. You need to have things like office hours or a Slack channel or some way for people to get questions answered. You build those things in. And obviously, if you're talking about it from a company perspective, you need your leaders. A lot of what I've talked about are grassroots things. But if your leaders at the top of the house are not talking about accessibility, that's unfortunately things aren't going to happen, because priorities are going to be priorities. And if your leaders aren't talking about accessibility, it's going to be so easy for a manager to say, well, don't worry about accessibility. Like, it's not a priority right now. But I tell you, if people, if the executives or if the owners of the company are saying this has to be accessible, then that trickles down and everyone understands that they play a role.
Yeah, that's 100% true. I mean, leadership is, well, the leadership may not be directly doing the accessibility or directly managing the accessibility. If they aren't actively supporting it, it weakens accessibility throughout whatever project you're working on.
And let's face it, the leadership owns the purse, right?
Right. Yeah.
So they do have a direct.
Though that can be a little bit different in open source, where the purses are are somewhat abstract in many respects.
Fair enough. Yes. But yes, having the leaders talking about it, and making it something that everyone understands their role, because part of it is people don't know what their role might be, and so defining that and saying that you own this part of accessibility and this is what you're accountable for.
Right.
That applies.
Yeah, and I think working out how do people interact across different areas. How do the designers interact with the accessibility team?
Yeah.
How does the accessibility team integrate with other processes? Like, what are the best stages for getting that accessibility work done? Because there's like a light degree that's always possible in design, but then there's more that's possible in wireframing, but it's not the right time for screen readers.
And every situation and every open source project will be so different. So it's important to just like sketch it out and then figure out. And sometimes it's trial and error, right? This is part of the whole journey piece, right? That no one way is going to be the quote unquote right way to do it. Every project is going to be different, but you got to at least start. You got to start somewhere. You can't just use the excuse of, well, we don't know where to go or we don't know how to start. Just start somewhere and then make mistakes and learn from them.
Yep, that's what it comes down to. So it's just 2 minutes left. So I'm going to really quickly answer a couple of questions here that are very specific. Michael Poso asked about the GAAD pledge. So I'm just going to provide that link. You can find that at gaad.foundation. And then it's under what we do, GAAD pledge. And I'm going to put that link in the chat. Another follow-up question there was somebody would love to share that 4% of all sites stat. And so that's from the WebAIM Million. And I will also share that link in the chat. It can be found at webaim.org/projects/million. And then I have to sign this out. Thank you so much, Jennison, for joining us for this. Joe. This was so much fun. I loved having this conversation with you.
Yeah, this has been great. And people can find me on LinkedIn or on X I put that in the chat earlier on, but if you just search for me under my name, I know it's a long one. I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone here. And yeah, thanks so much. And congratulations for this event. My hat's off to all of the organizers for making this such an inclusive event. And for all of you who are out there, like, thank the organizers. This is amazing. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you. So everybody can go to 2023.wpaccessibility.day/feedback to provide anonymous feedback on all speakers or in their presentations and enter to win a t-shirt. The next session is Accessibility Beyond Blindness with Ali Nimmons.
Nice.
Don't forget to visit our sponsors pages to grab virtual swag and enter for a chance to win great prizes. Thank you very much.
Thank you to WordPress Accessibility Day 2023 sponsors. Platinum sponsor, Equalize Digital. Equalize Digital's Accessibility Checker plugin is an automated accessibility scanning tool that helps WordPress websites become and stay accessible. Platinum sponsor, Gravity Forms. Gravity Forms is the professional form builder that you need to create beautiful, powerful, and accessible forms. Gold sponsors, 20i, DQ, Empire Caption Solutions, Pressable, and WP Engine. Silver sponsors, Code Geek, Drake Cooper, GoDaddy, Lone Rock Point, NerdPress, Overnight Website by Kinetic Iris, Riola Networks, A11Y Collective, and The Blogsmith. Bronze sponsors, Accessicart, Green Geeks Web Hosting, Hall Analysis SEO Consulting, HDC, ITX, IvyCat, MetaBox, Pixel Chefs, Simply Schedule Appointments, SiteGround, Termageddon, Underrepresented in Tech, Weglot, and Yoast.